The door handle dipped before I touched it. Not a jerk, not a rattle. Just pressure slow and careful, like something on the other side was learning how much resistance it needed before I'd notice. I stopped breathing without deciding to, fingers hovering inches from the cold metal, watching the handle ease back into place on its own. At the same moment, the forest went silent. Not gradually, completely. No wind in the trees, no insects, just the ticking of cooling metal from the engine and the sound of blood pushing too hard through my ears. I didn't understand what that meant yet. I stayed like that longer than made sense, eyes fixed on my reflection in the darkened window. It wavered slightly with each shallow breath, a pale shape floating over the suggestion of trees behind me. I half expected it to move on its own. When it didn't, that almost felt worse. I withdrew my hand slowly, listening for any sound that might tell me I'd imagined the whole thing. Nothing happened. Eventually, I stepped back, eased the door close without letting it latch, and stood there in the dirt, feeling foolish for how hard my hands were shaking. I told myself it had been pressure in the cab from the heat. Metal expands, handles stick, forests go quiet sometimes. There were explanations for all of it if I wanted them badly enough. That's when it started. The place itself had never bothered me before. It was a service road turnout, about 40 miles north of town. Nothing more than a wide patch of gravel where logging trucks used to idle before the mill shut down. I'd parked there dozens of times over the years, sometimes to take calls when I didn't want reception, sometimes just to sit and think without streetlights or neighbors or the low hum of other people's lives leaking through the walls. That night, I was there because my phone had died. I'd taken the long way home after work, the kind of drive you don't plan. Just follow until the road narrows and the sky opens up. By the time I realized how far I'd gone, the last bar of battery was already gone. No signal, no maps, just memory and whatever landmarks still looked familiar in the dark. The turnout did. Same bend in the road, same crooked post where a sign used to be, same shallow ditch where rainwater collected in spring. I pulled in, killed the engine, and sat there a while with the windows cracked, letting the night cool the cab. That was when I noticed how still it was. Forests always make noise, even at night, especially at night. Whined through needles, small animals moving through underbrush, insects working themselves into the air. This wasn't like that. It felt held, like someone had pressed a hand over the mouth of the world and told it to wait. I told myself it was late. I told myself it was my imagination filling in gaps because I was tired. I rolled the window up and leaned back in the seat, deciding to give it a minute before trying to drive again. That was when the first sound came. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a howl. It was a soft scrape, drawn out and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind the truck. Metal against metal, but not sharp. Like a fingernail dragged slowly along the side panel, testing the surface. I twisted in my seat, straining to see through the rear window. The darkness swallowed everything past the edge of the turnout. No movement, no shape. Just the faint reflection of my own face, pale and too close, floating in the glass. The scrape stopped. I waited, counted my breaths, listened for it to start. Again, it didn't. Instead, something shifted in the trees. Not footsteps, not branches snapping. Just weight, repositioning itself somewhere out there, patient enough to do it quietly. I should have left right then. Anyone normal would have. Anyone with sense would have turned the key, driven back the way they came, and laughed about it later. Instead, I stayed where I was, telling myself that if there was something out there, it would have made itself known by now. I was wrong about that. Over the next few minutes, little things kept happening. The kind of things you can almost ignore if you don't look at them directly. The side mirror vibrated once, just enough to blur the reflection before settling again. The hood dipped slightly, as if someone had leaned a hand against it and then thought better of it. Each time, I felt a spike of panic, followed by the same hollow relief when nothing else followed. No attack, no charge, no sudden rush from the trees. Just waiting. That pattern held long enough for denial to set in. I told myself it was an animal circling, unsure of the truck, curious but harmless. A deer, a bear, maybe. Something with claws and weight, but no reason to linger once it realized I wasn't food. I even cracked the window again, just an inch, to listen more closely. The night air slid in, cold and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and sap. Somewhere far off, something exhaled. Not a breath the way a person does, but a slow release of air, controlled and measured. I froze, fingers still on the window control. The sound came again, closer this time. I couldn't place it, too low to be wind, too steady to be an animal, sniffing around. It wasn't curious. It wasn't frantic. It sounded like something pacing its own patience. Then the silence returned, thicker than before. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Time felt unreliable in that space, stretched thin by how little was happening. Every nerve in my body stayed tuned to the edges of the truck, waiting for impact that never came. Instead, I became aware of smaller details, the faint creak of the seat beneath me, the way the dashboard light reflected off the windshield, the uneven rhythm of my own breathing as I tried to keep it quiet. That was when I noticed the scratches. They were on the driver's side door, just below the window. 4 of them, parallel, shallow enough that I hadn't heard them being made. They caught the dash light when I leaned closer, thin lines etched into the paint like someone had dragged something hard and narrow along the surface. They were too high to reach from the ground. I stared at them for a long time, trying to picture how they'd gotten there. An animal standing on its hind legs, maybe a bear, stretching. The thought didn't sit right. Bears don't measure their movements. They don't stop and start with intention. They don't test and retreat and wait. I reached out, touched one of the scratches with my fingertip. The metal was cool, undamaged enough that it hadn't broken through the paint completely. Whoever or whatever had made them hadn't pressed hard, just enough to leave a mark, as if it wanted to see if I'd notice. That was when I heard the footsteps. They didn't rush the truck. They didn't circle it. They moved from the trees to the edge of the turnout and stopped there, just beyond where the headlights would reach if I turned them on. The weight behind them was wrong for how softly they landed, each step placed with care, spread out as though the thing making them had learned how to distribute itself to keep the sound down. I turned my head slowly, eyes tracking the dark space ahead of the hood. Nothing stepped into view, but something was there. I felt it in the way the night leaned inward, the way my skin prickled along my arms, as though a pressure change had passed through the air. I was being watched, not in the frantic way prey gets watched, but with the quiet focus of something trying to understand what it was looking at. We should have stopped right there. The words came out of my mouth before I realized I'd spoken. They sounded thin and out of place inside the cab, like I'd broken a rule by making noise. I closed my mouth and waited for a response. There wasn't one. Instead, the smell changed. Wet fur, faint but unmistakable, threaded with something metallic underneath. It reminded me of pennies left out in the rain. The scent drifted closer, then stopped, hanging in the air just outside the truck. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the keys. I didn't turn on the lights. Every instinct screamed at me to do something, But there was a heavier feeling layered over it, one that told me movement would be a mistake. Whatever was out there wasn't done yet. It was still deciding. A shape shifted at the edge of my vision, not a full silhouette, just a suggestion of height where there shouldn't have been any, blocking out a sliver of starlight between the trees. 2 points of dull amber flickered, low in the dark, gone so quickly I almost convinced myself they'd been reflections from the dash dot almost. They reappeared a moment later, farther to the right, closer to the passenger side. The movement between appearances was smooth, efficient. No wasted steps, no sound. I realized then that it hadn't been circling me at random earlier. It had been mapping the truck, learning where I was, learning how far it could move without being seen. The door handle dipped again. This time, it didn't return to its place right away. It stayed lowered for a second too long, tension held in the mechanism like a question left hanging. My pulse hammered in my throat as I stared at it, waiting for the latch to release. It didn't. The handle eased back up, slower than before. That's when it changed. The pressure wasn't aimed at the doors after that, it moved to the windows. A faint tap near the rear passenger side, followed by the soft drag of something moving upward along the glass. Not scratching, not knocking, just contact, sliding along the surface as if feeling for thickness. Forgive. I curled forward in the seat, wrapping my arms around myself without realizing it. The smell of wet fur grew stronger, close enough now that it seeped through the seals. Around the door, I could hear breathing outside, slow and controlled, matching my own rhythm in a way that felt deliberate. The amber points appeared again, reflected faintly in the side mirror. This time they stayed, not staring straight in, angled slightly downward, as if the thing they belonged to had lowered its head to bring them level with the glass. I saw the curve of something around them, darker than the surrounding night, just enough to suggest a muzzle without defining it. No snarl, no bared teeth, just watching. Minutes passed like that, maybe longer. The thing outside shifted its weight once, the gravel crunching softly underfoot, then settled again. Each time I thought it might leave, it didn't. Each time I thought it might attack, it didn't. Instead, it waited. I don't know how long I could have stayed there if something else hadn't broken the pattern. A distant sound carried through. The trees are trucked on the main road, far enough away that it was more vibration than noise. The amber points flicked toward it. Tension pulled elsewhere for just a second. That was enough. I lunged for the keys, hand shaking so badly I missed them the first time. The engine turned over with a sound that felt impossibly loud in the stillness. Headlights flared to life, washing the turnout in white. The space in front of the truck was empty. No shape, no eyes, no movement. Just gravel, trees, and the shallow ditch where rainwater collected. I slammed the gear into drive and pulled out without looking back. Tires spinning briefly before catching Dot in the rearview mirror. As the turnout fell away, I saw a tall shape step back into the trees, moving with the same careful economy it had used all night. It didn't chase me, it didn't rush the road. It stood there, half hidden, watching the truck disappear. Didn't realize what it had already done. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that pressure again, the sense of something just outside my awareness, waiting for me to notice it. When I finally did drift off, I woke to silence so complete it felt like being underwater. I started checking locks obsessively after that, not just doors, windows, the truck, the shed out back. I'd run my hand along the frames, feeling for resistance, for signs of testing. I knew it was irrational. I knew that if something wanted to get in, a lock wouldn't stop it. Still, I checked over and over. A week later, I found a smear on the side of the truck where I'd washed it. Darker than oil, faintly metallic. I scrubbed until the paint shone again, but the smell lingered in my hands long after. I moved not long after that, told people it was for work, for a change of scenery. I didn't mention the nights I spent listening to the quiet, waiting for it to press in around me again. I didn't tell them how I still paused before touching a door handle, watching it first, just in case. Sometimes, late at night, when the world goes still in a way it shouldn't, I wonder if it's still out there, not hunting, not searching, just waiting. Sometimes I catch myself counting the seconds between sounds. It's not something I decide to do. It just happens. A car passing on the highway outside my apartment, pipes ticking as they cool, a neighbor's footsteps overhead. When the gaps stretch too long, when the quiet thickens instead of thinning, my body reacts before my thoughts do. My shoulders tense, my breath slows. I wait for pressure that never quite arrives. I've tried telling myself that whatever was out there stayed on that road, that it was tied to the place, to the trees, to the turnout where logging trucks used to idle, that it had no reason to follow me once I left. Those explanations sound reasonable when I say them out loud. They fall apart the moment the night behaves the way it did back then, too orderly, too still, like something is holding its breath. Once, a few months after the move, I woke up to find my front door unlocked. I know I locked it. I remember the weight of the deadbolt turning, the familiar resistance before it slid into place. That morning, the door was closed, just like I'd left it, but the lock turned freely when I tested it. No damage, no marks, nothing missing. The hallway outside was empty and quiet. The kind of quiet that carries sound too well. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at the handle, half expecting it to dip under my fingers. It didn't. I relocked the door and checked every window, every latch, every frame. Normal people would have shaken it off. Normal people would have blamed a mistake, a faulty lock, a restless night. I sat on the floor afterward, back against the door, listening to the building breathe around me, wondering how much of what I did now was habit and how much was training I hadn't agreed to. That's the part I don't know how to explain. Not the creature itself, not the eyes or the smell or the way it moved. It wasn't what it did that stayed with me. It was what it didn't do. It never rushed. It never forced anything. It never needed to. Every time I thought back on that night, I realized something new had been taken from me, not in the moment, but afterward. My sense of when it was safe to relax, my trust in silence. The simple act of opening a door without watching it first. Sometimes, when I'm standing in front of one late at night, key in hand, I get the distinct feeling that I'm being timed, that whatever is out there, wherever it is now, already knows how long it takes me to hesitate, how many seconds I'll wait before touching the handle, how quickly I'll notice if it moves. I don't think it wanted me that night. Not the way predators want prey. I think it wanted to see what I would do, and I don't know whether it ever stopped watching. I've started leaving lights on, not all of them. Just enough that the rooms don't fall completely dark at the same time. It's a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else, but it changes the way shadows settle. They stop pooling in corners. They stop connecting into shapes my mind can work with. I tell myself it's practical. I tell myself it's about safety. I don't mention the relief I feel when the light switches are already flipped before I reach them. There are nights when I sit on the edge of the bed and listen to the building settle, cataloguing each sound the way I did in the truck. The radiator, scythe, someone coughs 3 floors down, an elevator hums and stops. When the noises come in the order I expect, I relax just enough to breathe again. When they don't, I stay still. Once, very late, I heard a soft pressure against the front door. Not a knock, not a bump. Just the faintest suggestion of contact, followed by nothing at all. I watched the handle from across the room until my eyes burned, waiting for it to move the way it had before. It never did. By morning, there was no sign anyone had been there. No marks, no disturbance. The kind of absence that's harder to shake than evidence. I went to work anyway. I answered emails. I spoke to people. I let the day fill up around me like it always does. But every time I pass a closed door now, part of me pauses, watches, measures. I don't rush anymore. I don't assume. I wait to see if the world will move first. Whatever stood outside my truck that night didn't need to follow me. It didn't need to break in. It didn't need to prove anything. It learned how long I'd hesitate. And sometimes, when the quiet stretches just a little too far, I get the sense that it's still counting. I've tried changing the routine. Different routes home, different parking spots. I even switched the way I unlock my door keys, ready before I stop, hands steady, eyes on the handle the whole time. It helps in the way habits help. It gives my body something to do so my mind doesn't wander back to that turnout, to the way the night felt organized around me. But routines cut both ways. They make patterns. Every now and then, I notice how easily I slip back into the same pauses, the same careful timing. How quickly my breathing adjusts when a space goes quiet. It's not fear that does it anymore. It's familiarity, the kind you get when you've learned a rule without being taught it. I don't talk about that, Nate. Not really. People know I moved. They know I don't like driving far after dark. They joke about me being cautious, say it's smart. I let them think that. There's no way to explain the difference between caution and conditioning without sounding unhinged. Sometimes, late, when the building settles into its deepest quiet, I catch myself standing just inside the door, listening. Not for footsteps, not for breathing, for pressure, for the faint suggestion that something is testing the space again. Seeing if I'll notice, seeing if I've changed. If I'm honest, that's the part that unsettles me the most. Not the thought that it could come back, but the possibility that, if it did, I'd recognize the moment not as danger, but as a familiar weight. I don't know when it stopped feeling like something that happened to me. At some point, without a clear moment marking the change, it became something that happens with me. The pauses, the watching, the way my body prepares. It's self for contact that never arrives. I carry those things now, the same way you carry habits you didn't choose, posture learned from old injuries, flinches learned from near misses. There are nights when I stand in the kitchen with the lights low, listening to the building breathe, and I realize I've gone completely still, not frozen, not afraid, just quiet in a way that feels practiced, intentional, as if stillness itself is a response. I was taught. That's when the thought creeps in, uninvited and unwelcome. What if waiting wasn't just something it did? What if it was something it showed me? I don't dream about it anymore. Not the eyes, not the smell, not the shape half hidden by trees. What I dream about now is standing in front of a door, knowing it will move if I touch it, choosing to wait instead, testing the space, feeling the seconds stretch, learning how much pressure it takes before the world reacts. I wake up from those dreams, calm, alert, already listening. If it ever comes back, I don't think it will rush me. I don't think it will need to. It already knows how long I'll hesitate. And I'm no longer sure whether that knowledge belongs to it or to me. There's a moment, just before sleep takes me now, when the apartment settles into its deepest quiet. It doesn't happen at a fixed time. It isn't tied to traffic or neighbors or the building itself. It's just a point when everything that's going to make noise has already done so, and what's left feels held, balanced, as if the night has decided it doesn't need to move anymore. That's when I stop trying to fill the space. I don't reach for my phone. I don't turn on another light. I don't pace or check the locks again. I sit where I am and let the stillness sit back. I listen for pressure instead of sound, for intention instead of movement. Sometimes I think about that turnout, about the way the thing in the trees never crossed a certain line, how it stayed just far enough away to keep me guessing, just close enough to teach me where the edge was. Normal. People would say that's when the danger ends. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that's when the lesson sticks. Because now, when the quiet stretches and nothing happens, I don't feel relief. I feel recognition. The sense that I'm part of the pattern, whether I want to be or not. Another presence in the dark, measuring time, deciding when nor if anything needs to change. And every so often, when the silence feels especially deliberate, I get the unmistakable sense that I'm not alone in the waiting, that somewhere, not close enough to see and not far enough to forget, something is doing exactly what it did that night, watching not to chase, not to attack, just to see who waits longer. The last thing it took from me was the idea that waiting belongs to fear. I used to think hesitation meant weakness. The pausing was what you did when you didn't know what to do next. Now I understand it differently. Waiting is active, it's deliberate. It's a way of staying present without announcing yourself, a way of learning the shape of a moment before you step into it. Some nights, when the silence feels especially precise, I wonder if that's what it was doing all along. Not stalking, not hunting, studying. I don't check the turnout anymore. I don't drive that road. I don't look for signs or stories or anything that might confirm what I already know. There's no comfort in answers. Answers end things. Whatever started that night didn't end. It just shifted. I still pause at doors, still watch handles before I touch them. Still feel that faint sense of pressure sometimes, like the world is leaning toward me. Curious whether I'll notice. And when I do notice, when I stop and wait instead of rushing through the moment, the quiet feels satisfied. That's the part I don't say out loud. Because if it ever comes back, if it ever steps close enough for me to see, more than eyes and intention, I don't think it will be surprised by me. I think it already knows how long I can wait. And I think that was the point all along. I don't wait because I'm afraid anymore. I wait because I've learned what happens when I don't. Most nights pass without incident. Doors stay still, handles don't move. The quiet behaves the way it's supposed to. Those are the nights people would call normal. They are the ones that unsettle me the most. Because I know now that nothing happening doesn't mean nothing is there. It just means the moment hasn't been chosen yet. Pressure doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just rests, patient enough to be mistaken for absence. I still live my life. I still go to work. I still open doors. I just never do it quickly. And every time my hand hovers over a handle, every time I feel that familiar pause stretch a second longer than it should, I wonder if somewhere out there, not close, not far, something else has stopped too, waiting to see who moves first.